Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you've got your pillows fluffed, the lights dimmed way down, and maybe a gentle rain sound loop playing softly in the background. Tonight, we're going to dive into something incredibly chill and soothing, the lives of some Egyptian pharaohs. Not the exciting parts, mind you, not on chariot battles or dramatic plagues. We're focusing on the weird, often mundane, and very, very expensive architectural obsessions of the Old Kingdom. This is history that's just mildly interesting enough to keep you focused for a few minutes, but flat and flowing enough to gently push you right over the edge into a deep, boring sleep. So take a nice, deep, slow breath, and let's go all the way back to the 4th dynasty of Egypt, around 2600 BC. We're going to begin with the guy who really kicked off the whole pyramid craze, a pharaoh named Sneferu, which sounds kind of like a noise you make when you sneeze, honestly. Sneferu and the quest for the perfect angle. Sneferu, or Sneferu as he's sometimes called, was the founding pharaoh of the 4th dynasty. This is significant because the 3rd dynasty guy, Djoser, had built the very first big stone pyramid, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. It was a massive deal, a huge terraced structure, like a giant stone wedding cake. It was the original prototype, and it was certainly impressive. But Sneferu? He apparently looked at Djoser's effort and thought, that's cute, but I'm going to need 3 of these, and mine need to have smooth sides, no steps. I want the whole world to know I'm Pharaoh, but also that I'm a perfectionist with an unlimited budget. That's the mindset of an Old Kingdom Egyptian king, really. So, let's talk about the first of his big pyramid projects, the one at Maitum. He didn't start it, technically. It was probably started by his predecessor, but Sneferu took it over and decided to dramatically expand it, because why just finish a project when you can over-engineer it? Of course, he decided to convert this step pyramid into a true smooth-sided pyramid. This meant building layers of stone casing over the steps, filling in the gaps, and giving it that classic pointy triangle look we all know. Now, ancient Egyptian engineers were pretty smart, but even they had to learn by doing. They were basically beta testing pyramid construction at this scale. The Maitum pyramid was initially built with a steep slope, and when they started adding the outer smooth casing, they got the angle wrong. The foundation on the sand, the angle of the slope, the sheer weight of the added rock, it was a recipe for structural sadness. The whole outer layer, the entire smooth facade, collapsed at some point, either during construction or shortly after. Today, it mostly looks like a large 3-tiered tower rising out of the desert, a big, dusty monument to an expensive, early architectural failure. It's called the false pyramid sometimes, which is a bit mean, but, you know. Did this failure deter Sneferu? No, of course not. If you're an Egyptian pharaoh, the budget is infinite and the labor pool is vast. You simply decide that the collapse was just a practice run. A long, very expensive practice run involving countless tons of limestone. So, he abandoned Maitum and headed north to Dashur. The new rule was double down on the smooth-sided idea, but maybe, just maybe, learn a tiny bit from the previous disaster. The next project is one of his most famous, and it's called the Bent Pyramid. I mean, the name kind of gives away what went wrong, doesn't it? It's not called the Perfect Pyramid or the Sleek Pyramid. It's called the Bent Pyramid. It sits there today looking like a massive stone structure that someone slightly changed their mind halfway through construction. They started building this second pyramid at a very aggressive angle, a steep 54-degree pitch. The builders were probably thinking, okay, last time it was too steep, but we're really digging the pointy look, so let's stick with a steep angle. And what could possibly go wrong this time? Well, quite a lot, actually. As they got higher,
The weight and the angle started causing stress cracks and instability in the lower layers of stone. The engineers, who were probably having a collective panic attack, realized that if they continued at the current angle, the whole thing would likely suffer the same sad, sandy fate as made him. Imagine being the guy who had to go tell the pharaoh, Sneferu, the guy who already had one collapse under his belt, that his second giant funerary monument was also structurally questionable. That's a meeting you really want to skip. So, what did they do? Did they tear it down? Nah, they just dramatically changed the angle of the construction, mid-build. They reduced the slope from that steep 54 degrees to a much safer, more gradual 43 degrees. This is why the pyramid looks bent or kinked. It's a giant, expensive, and eternal monument to a last-minute engineering course correction. It's like baking a cake, realizing halfway through it's going to be structurally unsound, and then awkwardly slapping a whole new, flatter layer on top. The result is just a little off. The funny thing is, the exterior casing is actually remarkably well preserved. It still has much of the smooth white limestone that covered the whole thing, which gives us a rare glimpse into how dazzling these things must have looked when they were new. Dazzling, but also slightly crooked. Still not deterred, Sneferu went for a third try, because if two multi-million-ton pyramids haven't worked out quite right, the only logical step is to start a third one. You have to appreciate the sheer, stubborn commitment to the goal. His third pyramid, also a dashur, is known as the Red Pyramid. And guess what? They finally got it right. They used that shallower 43-degree angle from the start, taking absolutely no chances this time. It's the first true geometrically correct, smooth-sided pyramid in history. It's huge, it's stable, and it's a lovely reddish hue due to the local limestone used in its inner core. So, Sneferu, the king who really wanted a smooth pyramid, ended up with three massive ones, one that collapsed, one that was bent due to a structural crisis, and the third one which was finally, blissfully correct. Sneferu's family drama. Now, while Sneferu is busy obsessing over 43 degrees versus 54 degrees angles, his personal life was probably just as, well, dynastic and weird. He married a woman named Pharaohs I, who was likely his half-sister. Of course she was, because in Egyptian royalty, if you're not marrying a close relative, are you even royalty? This sort of incestuous marriage was totally fine because it kept the royal bloodline pure, or at least kept all the assets within the very small family group. Genetics aside, that's just good accounting. Pharaohs was important because she was the one who gave him the one thing he probably cared more about than the slope of a pyramid, a son, Khufu. Khufu is the guy who comes after Sneferu, and he's the one who takes his father's pyramid obsession and dials it up to a ludicrous final extreme. Pharaohs' burial is all a bizarre story that feels less like a majestic pharaoh's tomb and more like a massive, expensive clerical error.
Her tomb was supposed to be a nice, modest chamber near her husband's first attempt at a pyramid at Mitam. But when excavators finally found her tomb, or rather, a shaft leading to where her tomb should be, they found a sealed chamber. Inside, they found an amazing collection of her burial goods, furniture covered in gold, incredible artifacts, all sorts of things for her to enjoy in the afterlife. But here's the problem. Her body wasn't there. Also, the beautifully carved, expensive sarcophagus was empty. The whole discovery suggests that her original tomb was compromised, maybe by tomb robbers, and someone, probably Khufu, ordered a highly secretive, very clumsy reburial. Imagine the scene. A frantic reinterment operation where Khufu's people were instructed to gather all the amazing gold stuff, rush it to a new location near the Great Pyramid construction, and bury it deep, deep underground. But in the chaos and rush, either the body was lost or, more likely, It was already destroyed by the original robbers, and they didn't want to tell the young pharaoh the depressing truth, so they buried the empty box. The historian's theory is that the officials probably just told Khufu, "Yep, Pharaoh, we've secured the Queen Mother's body and reburied it safely just as you ordered." And Khufu, busy micromanaging the construction of the biggest pyramid in history, probably just grunted and went back to checking on the limestone shipments. It's a sad, slightly incompetent post-mortem drama. Even royalty can't escape a bureaucratic screw-up. So, that was Sneferu, a king who needed 3 tries to get his giant stone triangle right, and whose main wife ended up in a luxurious but ultimately bodiless second burial. A fittingly chaotic start to the 4th dynasty. The Great Pyramid Builder, Khufu. Now let's glide gently over to his son, Khufu. He succeeded Sneferu, and you can imagine the pressure. Your dad built 3 massive pyramids, so if you want to be taken seriously, you have to do something truly insane, something so colossal that people will be staring at it trying to figure out how you built it for the next 4,000 years. Khufu built the Great Pyramid of Giza, the biggest one, the one everyone thinks of, the thing that was the tallest man-made structure in the world for an absolutely ridiculous 3,800 years. And that's really all we know about Khufu personally. He built the pyramid. That's his entire legacy, practically. The pyramid is the man. We don't have a lot of statues of him. The one most famous statue we have of Khufu is a tiny little ivory figurine, barely 3 inches high. This is kind of ironic, isn't it? The pharaoh who built the most gargantuan, earth-shaking monument in history is mostly represented by a doll-sized figure you could easily lose in your couch cushions. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, paints Khufu as a bit of a crank, a deeply unpopular, tyrannical figure who closed all the temples to focus entirely on building his pyramid. He was, according to this version, basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of an obsessive construction manager who made everyone work non-stop. Now, modern archaeology suggests the workers were probably not slaves, but paid laborers, a large workforce with a complex hierarchy and a pretty good system of organization. They were well-fed, and they even got their own respectable tombs near the pyramid site. But regardless of their pay grade, building the Great Pyramid was a mind-numbing, colossal effort. Imagine the logistics for a moment. They're moving millions of blocks of stone. The average block weighs about 2.5 tons. Some of the inner chamber stones weigh up to 80 tons. They had to transport the granite from quarries hundreds of miles away in Aswan, up the Nile River. This wasn't Amazon Prime delivery, by the way. This was all muscle power, ropes and ramps, and the relentless, boring drag of physics, all for a single massive pointy stone box. The sheer scale of it is so deeply, profoundly unnecessary, which is why it's so perfect for our purposes. It's the ultimate expression of the Old Kingdom royal ego. I am Khufu. I will build a mountain out of stones, and it will be my mountain, and I'll get to hang out in it forever. The inner chambers are also weird. The main burial chamber, the king's chamber, is stark and simple. It's made of that beautiful red granite, and it contains an empty granite sarcophagus, which is too large to have been brought in after the chamber was constructed. It had to be placed there while the chamber was being constructed, then they built the rest of the pyramid around it. That's a serious commitment to the final container. Above the king's chamber, Khufu's engineers, clearly traumatized by Sneferu's bent pyramid disaster, created a series of 5 tiny relieving chambers. These were designed to deflect the massive, crushing weight of the thousands of tons of stone above it away from the burial chamber ceiling. This is where you see the real anxiety-fueled genius of the ancient engineers. They were so terrified of the ceiling collapsing and crushing the pharaoh's eternal resting spot that they went to the absolute maximum extreme of over-engineering the support structure. It's like putting 5 roofs on your house just in case. But here's the really quiet, slightly underwhelming part. When the archaeologists finally got into the main chamber, it was already empty. The sarcophagus was there, sure, but no body, and no burial goods. So, Khufu spent 20 years moving 2.3 million blocks of stone, bankrupted the economy according to Herodotus, and created the most enduring structure on Earth, only for it to be robbed centuries later. An enormous, eternal monument to absence. It's almost the most perfectly boring, slightly tragic punchline in all of history. Let's just pause on that thought for a moment, letting the sheer, quiet disappointment of Khufu's post-mortem robbery float over you. Millions of man-hours, decades of obsession, the greatest monument ever conceived. And the tomb robbers still won. They always do. Khufu's successor, Djedefre, and the short-lived dynasty. Now, Khufu's son, Djedefre, came next. We don't talk about Djedefre much because he's kind of the odd one out. He decided he was not going to be buried at Giza, near his father's colossal, showy monument. Instead, he decided to build his pyramid at a location called Abu Rawish, which is a few miles north of Giza. This was seen as a bit strange, a bit rebellious, maybe even a sign of a bit of a royal family spat. Because why wouldn't you want to be near the most famous construction site ever? It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of moving to a slightly less fashionable suburb. Djedefre's pyramid was never completed, and it's now the most northern of the Old Kingdom pyramids. It's mostly ruined now, just a foundation and a massive pit, which makes it look less like a glorious tomb and more like a partially excavated construction zone. The size of the base suggests that had it been completed, it would have been roughly the size of the Pyramid of Menkaura, the smallest of the three main Giza pyramids. So, a big project, but not a crazy one-upping dad project. He was also the first pharaoh to officially use the title Son of Ra, or Re, linking the pharaoh directly to the sun god. This might be a clue as to why he moved away from Giza. Perhaps he was trying to shift the focus from the sheer brute force construction of the pharaoh's ego to a more spiritual, divine connection. Or maybe he just really disliked the traffic at Giza. We'll never know. What we do know is that after his death, his pyramid was savagely dismantled and quarried for stone in later periods. This has led some historians to believe that Djedefre's reign was maybe a bit short, a bit controversial, and that he may have been overthrown or had his memory deliberately erased by his successors, who were probably not his sons. You can almost feel the quiet, slightly simmering resentment and dynastic maneuvering. Khufu had other sons, of course, lots of them, and one of them, Khafre, ended up succeeding Djedefre. It's complicated and the records are fuzzy. It's all very Game of Thrones, but with less drama and more extremely large limestone blocks. Khafre, Khufu's son, and the Sphinx. So Khafre steps up, and he immediately goes back to Giza. He clearly decided that Djedefre's Abu Rawish experiment was a terrible idea. Family business must be conducted at the family site. Khafre builds his pyramid right next to his father's. It's the second largest of the three. It looks taller than Khufu's sometimes, but that's just an optical illusion. Khafre had the good sense to build his pyramid on a slightly higher piece of bedrock, so it appears to loom over his dad's. It's a classic power move. I built mine slightly shorter, father, but look, it still dominates. His pyramid is the one that still retains a smooth cap of the original white casing stones at the very apex. It's a nice little peek into what the whole structure would have looked like when new, a huge glittering white triangle under the desert sun. Khafre is also responsible for what is arguably the most recognizable image in all of Egypt, outside of the Great Pyramid itself, the Great Sphinx of Giza. The Sphinx is this massive limestone creature with the body of a lion and almost certainly the head of Pharaoh Khafre. It sits there, gazing perpetually eastward, and it is a fascinating piece of boring history. It's not just a statue. It's an entire section of rock that Khafre's builders decided to carve out. Instead of clearing it away or using the stone, Khafre's team looked at this giant, awkward rock and said, you know what, let's just turn it into a giant protective lion with the pharaoh's face. That's the sort of thought process that makes this era so weird. It's the definition of because we can. the Sphinx is 66 feet high and 240 feet long. It's massive, and it's not really built of blocks like the pyramids. It's carved in situ. That means it was carved from the bedrock, and the stone is not the highest quality. It's soft, porous limestone, which is why the Sphinx has been constantly eroding and being buried and restored for the last 4 millennia. It's a geological underdog, constantly fighting to stay visible. The Sphinx is an ancient, enigmatic symbol that has led to countless theories about secret chambers, aliens, and forgotten civilizations. But the reality is probably much simpler and more boring. It was a huge, dramatic piece of dynastic propaganda. It was a massive, divine representation of Khafre, forever guarding his tomb and that of his father. A gentle, sleepy time reminder that the pharaoh's power was eternal, protected by a giant lion man. It's interesting to note that the Sphinx has been buried up to its shoulders in sand multiple times. Egyptians in later dynasties actually had to dig it out. The most famous dig out was performed by a future pharaoh, Thutmose IV, who claimed he fell asleep near the buried head and the Sphinx spoke to him in a dream, promising him the throne if he cleared the sand away. A great story, but also a very simple way to explain a massive, expensive public works project. The ancient rock deity told me to do it, so it's not my fault. So, Khafre builds a giant pyramid, slightly taller than his dad's, and a massive lion-headed statue that's constantly being buried in sand. A good, solid, slightly weird pharaoh. And now, as Khafre gazes silently into the east, and the sand gently drifts around the massive paws of the Great Sphinx, let's just let that enormous, slow, quiet weight of the Giza Plateau settle on your mind. All those millions of tons of stone, built for eternity, just sitting there, waiting for the sand to come back. There's really no rush. Menkaure, the last Giza pyramid, and the size problem. Finally, the third and last of the great Giza pyramid builders was Menkaure, who was Khafre's son, and thus Sneferu's grandson and Khufu's nephew. By the time Menkaure came to power, the sheer, crushing scale of pyramid building was starting to lose its luster. The resources were probably stretched thin, and the initial architectural novelty had definitely worn off. Menkaure's pyramid is the smallest of the 3 great pyramids. It's barely half the height of the other 2. It looks like it's waving a tiny flag in the shadow of its enormous relatives. It's the equivalent of the youngest sibling who got a much smaller allowance. But Menkaure tried to make up for the lack of size with expensive flair. While the other 2 were mostly cased in white limestone, Menkaure covered the lower 16 courses of his pyramid with beautiful, costly Aswan granite. This granite is dark, hard, and really difficult to cut and transport. It was a massive upgrade in material quality, a kind of quality over quantity approach. But even this upgrade was a bit heart-hafted. They only managed to cover the bottom third of the pyramid in granite before Menkaure died, which is a common problem with massive projects. The work stopped, and his successor ended up finishing the top of the pyramid with plain limestone, so it looks like he ran out of money, or patience. It's a nice small-scale monument to budget cuts and pharaonic mortality. Inside, Menkaure's burial chamber is actually quite beautiful. It was carved and decorated, and it's quite a departure from the stark, simple rooms of Khufu and Khafre. He tried, honestly. He went for quality, but the granite was clearly a logistical nightmare, and he ran out of time. Ironically, the final resting place of Menkaure's mummy, which was placed in a beautiful basalt sarcophagus, is the most tragic part of the story. The sarcophagus was recovered from the pyramid in the 19th century and was being shipped to England to be placed in the British Museum. But the ship carrying it, named the Beatrice, sank off the coast of Spain. So, the biggest sarcophagus, from the smallest of the Giza pyramids, the one built with all that expensive granite, was lost to the bottom of the Mediterranean. It's a beautifully melancholy end for a pharaoh
who couldn't quite compete with the scale of his forebears. It's the ultimate quiet historical tragedy, an eternal monument built to last forever, only for its most precious cargo to be lost in an utterly mundane maritime shipping accident. The Fourth Dynasty, the great age of the pyramids, really ends on a whimper, not a bang. It ends with a small, granite-covered pyramid and a sarcophagus lying silently in the dark depths of the sea. And as we settle into the quiet, slightly sad resignation of Menkaure's sunken sarcophagus, let's just let the sheer, repetitive boredom of dynasty and stone and sand wash over you. We've gone from the bent pyramid to the Great Pyramid, and now to the small one that lost its soul to the sea. We'll take a quiet moment here to let you drift away, and when we come back, we'll gently float over to another Egyptian pharaoh with even more peculiar habits and slightly less successful construction projects. No sudden movements, no shocks, just the quiet, dull flow of history.
We're gliding smoothly now into the Middle Kingdom, an era that follows the quiet administrative success of Mentuhotep II's reunification. If the Old Kingdom was defined by giant, showy, and ultimately fragile pyramids, the Middle Kingdom is defined by a deep, quiet sense of paranoia and a love of extremely boring fortresses. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, in particular, were not the flashy, ego-driven builders of Giza. They were practical, cautious, and slightly neurotic rulers who had lived through the memory of the first intermediate period's anarchy. They weren't building monuments to their divinity. They were building monuments to border security and risk management. Senuseret III, the fortress king, and his sad face. Let's focus on Senuseret III, one of the most powerful and frankly most interesting pharaohs of this dynasty. He was a military man, a king who personally led campaigns into Nubia to the south. But what's most striking about him isn't his military prowess. It's the strange, almost melancholy way he chose to be depicted in his statues. The statues of Senuseret III are a dramatic departure from the serene, idealized faces of Old Kingdom pharaohs. Instead of looking like an eternally young, flawless god, Senuseret III looks tired. His face is lined, his features are severe, and his eyes often appear heavy, almost sagging with the weight of responsibility. They look like the face of a man who has too much paperwork and hasn't slept properly in years. Historians think this was a deliberate artistic choice. It wasn't just how he looked, it was how he wanted to be remembered as a serious, concerned, and world-weary leader. He was basically saying, "Look at my face. This is the stress of keeping Egypt together. I am not some youthful god. I am a dedicated civil servant, and it is exhausting." It's an unexpectedly modern, slightly pathetic self-portrait, perfectly fitting for a king obsessed with boring architecture. The Sudanic fortress system. Senuseret III's main building projects were not pyramids, but a system of massive, complex fortresses built along the second cataract of the Nile in Nubia. This was the southern border of Egyptian control, and it was crucial for protecting Egypt's access to gold, incense, and other resources. The scale of these fortresses is genuinely astonishing. They weren't just simple walls. They were huge stone complexes that look more like medieval castles than ancient Egyptian outposts. They were built on hillsides and designed to be almost impregnable. Let's take Buin, for example. Buin was the crown jewel of this fortress system. Imagine walking through it today. It had massive, sloping mud brick walls designed to deflect incoming arrows and siege weapons. It had a deep, dry moat cut into the bedrock, making it impossible for invaders to rush the walls. The walls were topped with battlements and loopholes for archers. It even had a large glacis, a sloping bank to make climbing difficult. These forts were not meant to simply deter an invasion, they were meant to end the very thought of an invasion. They were the physical manifestation of the Middle Kingdom's anxiety, built on the principle of maximum, tedious security. The purpose of this vast network of isolated, high-security structures was twofold: border defense, to keep the potentially hostile Nubian tribes from moving north into Egypt,
and trade control, to carefully regulate and tax the flow of goods coming from the south. Life in these forts must have been intensely monotonous. You had a small garrison of soldiers, a few bureaucrats, maybe a priest or two, all stuck in a massive mud brick castle hundreds of miles from the comforts of the Nile Valley, staring south into the vast, quiet expanse of the Nubian desert. It was the ancient world's worst military posting. And Senuseret III loved this. He didn't just build the forts, he wrote the actual rules for running them. He had a great stone inscription placed in one of the temples near the border that basically says, "I am the king who created this border. I am the one who fights for it. If you, my son, who rules after me, fail to defend this border, then you are no son of mine." It's a slightly aggressive, very clear statement of his obsession with security. Amenemhat I and the Wall of the Prince. The founding pharaoh of this dynasty, Amenemhat I, was equally paranoid, but he focused his security efforts on the opposite border, the east, near the Sinai Peninsula. Amenemhat I had a famously rocky start to his reign. He was likely a vizier who took the throne after the death of the previous king, and he may have even been assassinated later in his own palace, a fate we'll get to in a moment. His major project was known as the Walls of the Prince, or the Wall of the Ruler. This was a massive chain of fortified settlements and patrols built across the eastern delta region. Its purpose was simple: to keep the nomadic peoples of the Near East, referred to as the Asiatics, from quietly slipping into the fertile Nile delta. This wasn't a giant Great Wall of China structure, it was a line of boring, fortified posts and watchtowers constantly patrolled. It was less a wall and more a continuous security perimeter. It was the ancient version of a heavily guarded fence, designed to control immigration and prevent any further political destabilization that might lead to another collapse like the one they had just experienced. Amenemhat I essentially said, "We're done with instability. We're building giant, boring fences and fortresses everywhere, and then we're going to sit inside them and quietly manage the country." The legacy of the Middle Kingdom is one of calculated isolationism and extreme defensive architecture. The assassination and the instruction. Now, despite all his caution and all his walls, Amenemhat I still met a violent, quiet end in his own palace. The details are fuzzy, but it appears he was assassinated by a small conspiracy of courtiers while his son, Senuseret I, was away campaigning in Libya. A quiet, terrifying palace coup. The result of this assassination is one of the most fascinating pieces of Middle Kingdom literature, the Instruction of Amenemhat. This text, supposedly written by the dead pharaoh's spirit to his son, Senuseret I, is a long, mournful, and incredibly cynical piece of advice. It's essentially a royal father's very stressed-out letter from the beyond the grave. The main takeaway is, don't trust anyone. It says, "Trust no brother, know no friend, nor make for yourself intimate companions." He goes on to recount his own death, advising his son, "It was supper time, and night had come. I was asleep on my couch. The striking force, it was for my sake that I commanded it to act. Yet he who ate my food raised a conspiracy against me." It's a beautifully melancholy piece of paranoia. The pharaoh who was protected by walls, fortresses, and armies was killed by the people he ate dinner with. He built the world's most secure external borders, only to forget that his internal borders, the palace courtiers, were far more dangerous. Senuseret I, his son, immediately established a co-regency. He brought his son Amenemhat II into power while he was still alive. This was a crucial dynastic move designed to prevent any future power vacuum or succession chaos. It was their way of saying, "We learned our lesson. No more sudden, messy palace coups. We're going to make sure the next king is firmly in place well before the current one dies." It's a very sensible, very boring administrative precaution against tragedy. And that's the spirit of the Middle Kingdom, an age of deep, structural security where the most dramatic moments were assassinations followed by sensible administrative reform. The Hyksos and the Second Intermediate Period. The great irony of all these walls and fortresses is that they ultimately failed. The 12th dynasty was followed by the 13th, which was much weaker and suffered from the same kind of slow, bureaucratic decay that doomed the Old Kingdom. And then, a new group of people, whom the Egyptians called the Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands, started migrating into the Delta region. They were mostly people from the Levant, and they came in large numbers. The Egyptians couldn't stop the quiet, steady demographic pressure and political infiltration. Eventually, the Hyksos became strong enough to essentially take over the northern half of Egypt, establishing their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, ruling from the city of Avaris in the Delta. This starts the second intermediate period. Again, not a glorious, dramatic invasion, but a long, slow process of political erosion where one group simply gained administrative and military control over a region that had been too focused on its southern fortresses and eastern walls. The key to the Hyksos' success wasn't some magical weapon. It was probably just better technology and organization. They brought with them the composite bow, more advanced bronze tools, and, most importantly, the horse and chariot. The Egyptians, who had been resting on their laurels, were suddenly facing faster, better-equipped opponents. So, for over 100 years, Egypt was split, the Hyksos ruling the north from Avaris in the Delta, and a series of weak Theban-based pharaohs ruling the south, confined to a small area. This is a quiet, humiliating time for the Egyptians. The glorious land of the Nile was divided and ruled by foreigners. And it is here, in the quiet, divided sorrow of the second intermediate period, that we'll gently pause. We've gone from the bent pyramids of Sneferu to the honey-covered servants of Pepi II, and now to the administrative failure of the Middle Kingdom's walls. History, it turns out, is mostly about very slow decline and inadequate border control. We'll let the slow, quiet shame of the Hyksos rule settle for a moment, and when we return, we'll talk about
I hope the quiet monotony of Middle Kingdom fortresses and bureaucratic decay is working its sleepy magic. We've floated through the humiliation of the second intermediate period, where the Hyksos, those rulers of foreign lands, were quietly running the show in the north, leaving the native Egyptian pharaohs cooped up down south in Thebes. This division was not a sudden dramatic disaster. It was a century of smoldering, low-grade resentment. Imagine living in a world where the capital of your country is ruled by foreigners with better chariots. It's a constant, quiet affront to the royal ego. Sekenenre Tao II, the martyr who got hit in the head. The family that finally decided they'd had enough was the Theban royal line, and the drama, which we will keep very, very quiet, starts with a pharaoh named Sekenenre Tao II, often called the Brave. Now, we don't know much about his reign, which was short, but we know exactly how he died, thanks to his mummy. When his mummy was scientifically examined in the 19th and 20th centuries, it revealed a profoundly violent death. Sekenenre Tao's skull was absolutely shattered. He had multiple, severe wounds that could not have been inflicted in a casual way. The wounds suggest he was either killed in a furious, close-quarters battle, or, more likely, he was captured and executed in a very brutal fashion. The cuts on his head match the known weapons used by the Hyksos, particularly the battle axe, and possibly a dagger blow to the neck, which suggests he was killed while lying down. He died in his 40s, probably while leading a small early attempt to expel the Hyksos. He became an instant martyr for the cause of national liberation. His death transformed the quiet territorial squabble into a holy war for national liberation. It provided the ultimate tragic motivation for his two sons who succeeded him, Kamose and later Ahmose I. The image of the brave king violently executed by the foreign occupiers
was the quiet, simmering fuel that ignited the new kingdom. Komos, the angry, impatient brother. Next up is Komos, the older son, who was furious, impatient, and clearly determined to avenge his father and kick out the Hyksos. He was the classic act first, think later type of ruler. We know his story from 2 stone stelae found in Thebes, which are essentially propaganda documents laying out his grievances and his plans. Komos's attitude can be summed up as, "I can't sleep." He complains that it's humiliating to be a sovereign in Thebes when a foreign king, the Hyksos king Apophis, sits in Avaris, and a Nubian king sits just behind him in the south. In his own words, as recorded on the stela, "I would like to know what purpose serves this my strength, when a chieftain in Avaris and another in Cush share this land with me, when I sit associated with an Asiatic and a Nubian, and each man possesses his slice of this Egypt." He was basically throwing a royal tantrum because he had to share. He saw the Hyksos capital of Avaris as an irritation on his national map. His advisors, however, were not feeling the same energy. They wanted Komos to chill out. They said, "Look, we're doing fine. We have the fertile land in the south. We can graze our cattle. We can sail up and down the Nile in peace. Just wait it out. Let the Hyksos have the delta. It's not worth the fight." Komos absolutely refused. He called his council cowards and immediately launched an attack north. His campaign was successful, but short-lived. He managed to raid and plunder the Hyksos territory, disrupt their trade, and generally make a nuisance of himself. He captured a messenger carrying a desperate letter from the Hyksos king Apophis to the Nubian king in the south, trying to forge an alliance against Komos. This interception was a major propaganda win for Komos, proving that the Hyksos were scared. Komos managed to push north and even briefly laid siege to Avaris, but he died, probably after only 3 years on the throne. We don't know exactly how he died, maybe in battle, maybe of disease. But his campaign was incomplete. He didn't finish the job, but he proved it could be done. He was the angry, slightly reckless older brother who starts the fight and then leaves his younger sibling to finish it. Ahmose I, the quiet, efficient younger brother. The true founder of the new kingdom, the one who actually completed the job, was Ahmose I, Komos's younger brother. He was probably still a child when his father was killed and his brother started his brief, angry campaign. Ahmose came to the throne, and rather than rushing into a fight, he took the quiet, sensible approach. He recognized that to beat the Hyksos, they needed to adopt the Hyksos' own technology. This is the subtle, boring brilliance of the new kingdom's launch. Ahmose didn't rely on the old, slow Egyptian armies. He embraced the horse and chariot. He learned how to use the composite bow. He built a navy. He was patient and methodical, spending his early years consolidating power in the south and building up his army's new, modern equipment. After over a decade of preparation, Ahmose launched his final campaign. He systematically pushed the Hyksos back. The details of the siege of Avaris are thankfully sparse and unemotional. The most important thing is that he took the city. He finally expelled the Hyksos king and his court from the Nile Delta. Ahmose didn't stop there. He pursued the retreating Hyksos forces all the way into Palestine, besieging them for 3 years at the fortress of Sharuhen. This was a crucial strategic move. It wasn't just about winning back Egyptian territory. It was about creating a security buffer. Ahmose realized that if you don't control the people who might invade, they will simply come back later. This is the moment when the concept of the Egyptian Empire was truly born, an aggressive, proactive foreign policy designed to prevent future humiliation. The New Kingdom mindset. With the expulsion of the Hyksos, the New Kingdom began. This is a dramatic shift in the royal mindset, which is perfect for our purposes because it leads to a new kind of opulent, bombastic, and ultimately self-destructive behavior. The New Kingdom pharaohs learned two core lessons from the previous centuries. Paranoia is justified. Foreigners will try to take over if you let them. And size matters again. The quiet austerity and practical fortresses of the Middle Kingdom were not enough. They needed showy, massive temples and tombs to remind everyone, both inside and outside Egypt, that the pharaoh was back and he was absolutely unconditionally in charge. The capital shifted firmly to Thebes, a city that had been the center of resistance. The local Theban deity, Amun, was elevated to the status of a national supreme god, often merged with the old sun god as Amun-Ra. The priests of Amun, therefore, suddenly became extremely rich and incredibly powerful, which will, in a very boring, inevitable way, lead to problems later. Ahmose I's reign was a massive success, but it was of methodical, patient effort, finally resulting in a glorious moment of national cleansing. He brought back the old confidence and then spent his final years rebuilding the infrastructure, dredging canals, repairing temples, and generally doing the important, boring work of nation building. We'll leave Ahmose I now, resting in the absolute glow of his victory. The New Kingdom has begun, and with it, a return to the huge, showy displays of power, but this time with an aggressive, imperial edge. We've traded paranoia for swagger, which can be as relaxing in its sheer predictability. In our next quiet segment, we'll gently ease into the early great pharaohs of this new bombastic age, starting with the quiet, very successful, and surprisingly...
Listeners, we're now deep into the New Kingdom, an era defined by empire building and a lot of very ostentatious displays of power. After the practical, militaristic success of Ahmose I in booting out the Hyksos, the stage was set for some truly grand, slightly dramatic pharaohs. Tonight, we're going to focus on a figure who defied all the tedious royal norms by simply deciding to rule the most powerful country on earth as a man. I'm talking about the quiet, very successful, and architecturally obsessed pharaoh Hatshepsut. The peaceful coup of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was a high-status royal woman. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and the wife of Thutmose II, her half-brother. Incestuous marriage? Of course, it's the standard Egyptian royal practice. When Thutmose II died, the legal heir to the throne was a young boy, his son by a minor wife, named Thutmose III. Hatshepsut became the regent for the boy king. This is the official boring title, the adult who runs the country until the child is old enough to rule. Most royal women in this position would have quietly ruled for a few years, ensuring the boy's succession, and then faded back into the palace. Hatshepsut, however, had absolutely zero interest in fading back. After a few years of ruling as regent, she made the quiet, stunning decision to simply promote herself to pharaoh, not queen or regent, but full, divine, title-bearing king of Upper and Lower Egypt. It was a move unprecedented in Egyptian history. She didn't seize power violently. It was more of a carefully orchestrated public relations campaign wrapped in religious necessity. She claimed that the god Amun himself had appeared to her mother in a divine, dreamlike conception, declaring Hatshepsut was his true daughter and the rightful king. It was a flawless piece of spiritual spin. To make her position official and palatable to the deeply traditional Egyptian court, she had to visually conform to the role. In her statues, she is often depicted wearing the full royal regalia, the Nemes headdress, the double crown of Egypt, and most importantly, the false ceremonial beard. Yes, the most powerful woman in the ancient world felt she needed to strap on a giant fake beard to do her job. It's wonderfully absurd, isn't it? It's a quiet testament to the rigid gender rules of Egyptian royalty that even a pharaoh had to pretend to be a man to truly rule. Her reign, which lasted for about 22 years, was not marked by huge, dramatic wars. It was a time of peaceful prosperity, focused on trade and construction. The perfect sleepy time subject. The architectural obsession, Deir el-Bahari. Hatshepsut's obsession wasn't conquest, it was architecture. She didn't want to conquer Nubia. She wanted to build something that would make the old pyramid builders weep with jealousy. Her major construction project was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, right next to the earlier, quieter one built by Mentuhotep II. Her temple is an absolute masterpiece of ancient design. It is built directly into the towering, dramatic cliffs, a multi-tiered, perfectly symmetrical structure that looks utterly stunning. It's so well designed that it looks less like an ancient temple and more like a modernist palace built for the cliffs. The reliefs and inscriptions on the walls of this temple are where Hatshepsut tells her own story, the divine birth, the coronation, and her greatest achievement, the trade expedition to the land of Punt. This was an unbelievably boring but incredibly important trade mission. Punt was a mythical, distant land, probably somewhere in modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. Getting there was a huge logistical feat, but the goal was simple and mundane: frankincense and myrrh. The temple walls lovingly detail the entire expedition: the ships, the foreign people, the houses of Punt, and the highly desirable cargo they brought back: incense, ebony, ivory, gold, and crucially, live myrrh trees for her gardens. This was a massive botanical coup. No great battles, just a very successful shopping trip. Hatshepsut was essentially bragging about how great her supply chain was. She built a massive, glorious temple to celebrate her ability to procure rare aromatic resins for temple ceremonies. That's the sort of low-stakes bragging that is perfect for drifting off to sleep. The obelisk problem. Hatshepsut's other obsession was with obelisks. These are those tall, slender, four-sided stone monuments that taper to a pyramid shape at the top. They symbolize the sun god Ra and require a truly insane level of logistical commitment to build and install. She erected several huge obelisks at the Temple of Karnak. The largest of these were 97 feet tall, each carved from a single piece of pink Aswan granite. Think about the quiet, mind-numbing labor involved. Quarrying, carving a single perfect piece of granite almost 100 feet long. This involves hours of patient chiseling, pounding, and fire setting to split the stone. Transportation, dragging the immense, multi-hundred-ton stone slab onto a barge. This barge then had to sail several hundred miles down the Nile from the Aswan quarries to Thebes. It required careful timing, relying on the annual Nile flood. Erection, getting the obelisk off the barge and standing it upright. This required massive earthen ramps, ropes, and thousands of men pulling with rhythmic, monotonous effort. Hatshepsut's inscription on the base of one of her Karnak obelisks is pure, slightly arrogant swagger. She wrote that she did it so fast that she completed the entire project
from quarrying to erection in just 7 months. This claim is probably an exaggeration, but it demonstrates the speed and scale of her obsession. She wanted the most enormous, the most perfect, and the fastest-built obelisks. It's the ultimate expression of bureaucratic efficiency meeting pharaonic ego. One of her other obelisks actually cracked during the quarrying process. It's still there, lying in the Aswan quarry, half-carved, known today as the unfinished obelisk. It's a sad, quiet monument to a slight technical error, a testament to the immense difficulty of working with granite, and a reminder that even pharaohs cannot defeat physics. Thutmose III and the quiet vengeance. Now what about the young king, Thutmose III, who Hatshepsut had been ruling over? He spent the 2 decades of her reign in the background, likely being trained in the army, quietly waiting for his turn. You can imagine the simmering resentment. When Hatshepsut finally died, peacefully as far as we know, Thutmose III took the throne as the sole ruler. He immediately proved to be one of Egypt's greatest military commanders, earning the title the Napoleon of Egypt. He didn't mess around. But what did he do to the memory of the woman who usurped his throne? He didn't execute anyone or launch a bloody purge. Instead, he carried out a long, quiet campaign of erasure. Years after her death, Thutmose III began systematically erasing Hatshepsut's name and image from monuments across Egypt. Her cartouches, the royal names written in the oval loops, were hacked out of the stone. Her statues were pulled down and smashed, or deliberately defaced. In some cases, he simply built a wall around her obelisks at Karnak, obscuring them from public view. This wasn't done out of immediate, furious rage. It was a slow, careful, decades-long effort. It suggests a deep, cold, bureaucratic vendetta. He wasn't destroying her memory out of passion. He was doing it to correct the historical record and prevent future female pharaohs from using her as a precedent. He was ensuring the boring, male-dominated status quo remained intact. It's the most subtle, and therefore the most sleep-inducing act of vengeance in ancient history, a quiet, systematic chipping away at a dead relative's legacy. We owe the rediscovery of Hatshepsut's reign to the fact that her builders were so good. The erasure was done carefully, but not perfectly. The massive scale of her buildings meant that later historians could piece together her story from the faint outlines and hidden inscriptions. And so we leave Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh with a fake beard, her great supply chain achievements, and the thousands of chipped-away names. Her story is a quiet, fascinating blend of incredible power and profound insecurity. Let the gentle, rhythmic sound of chisels slowly hacking away at granite wash over you now. The sound of a very successful, very paranoid king correcting the past. When we return, we'll move on to a figure who tried to erase not just one pharaoh, but all of the Egyptian gods themselves.
We're deep in the New Kingdom now, a time of wealth, empire, and now we come to a pharaoh who decided the entire Egyptian theological system was completely wrong and needed a dramatic, immediate reboot. We're talking about Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, who led Egypt through one of its most bizarre, quiet, and existential crises. Amenhotep IV, the king who changed his name. Akhenaten was born as Amenhotep IV. He was the son of Amenhotep III, a massive, successful king whose reign was known for peace, incredible wealth, and opulence. Amenhotep III was the king who sent letters to other monarchs basically saying, "Please send your beautiful daughters and lots of gold. I'm doing great." It was a high point for Egyptian global swagger. So Amenhotep IV inherits this massive, stable, rich kingdom, but instead of settling in and enjoying the wealth, he seemed to have a massive religious conversion, or at least a profound philosophical disagreement with the status quo. The big problem was the priesthood of Amun.
Remember how we said the god Amun-Ra became the supreme state god in Thebes? Well, his priests had become unbelievably rich and powerful. They controlled vast tracts of land, huge amounts of wealth, and essentially ran a parallel power structure that rivaled the pharaoh's own. This is a very common, very boring political problem. Too much power in the hands of the clergy. Amenhotep IV decided he'd had enough of the rich political priests of Amun. He didn't just disagree with them, he decided their entire god was a distraction. He chose to focus on a single, universal deity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. This wasn't a sun god in the traditional sense, but the physical, life-giving power of the sun itself. It was monotheism, or something very close to it, introduced suddenly and dramatically to a profoundly polytheistic society. Around the 5th year of his reign, he changed his name from Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. This wasn't a rebranding, it was a declaration of war on the entire religious establishment. The new city and the weird art. Akhenaten didn't just ban the worship of Amun, he actively persecuted it. He sent scribes across Egypt to systematically chip away the name of Amun from temples, inscriptions, and even his own father's name on monuments. It's the same slow, quiet, tedious erasure that Thutmose III performed on Hatshepsut, but this time it was aimed at a god. Then, in a fit of royal stubbornness, he decided he couldn't live in Thebes anymore because it was the seat of the hated Amun priesthood. So he ordered the construction of an entirely new, massive capital city built from scratch in the middle of the desert. This new city was called Akhenaten, Horizon of the Aten, and it is known today as Amarna. Imagine the logistical nightmare, moving the entire government, the royal family, the workers, and the necessary infrastructure hundreds of miles to a site that had never been settled just because the pharaoh couldn't stand the local clergy. It was the ultimate, massive, passive-aggressive flounce. The city was built with incredible speed, using a new, smaller, and easier-to-handle type of stone block called talatat. This allowed for rapid construction, resulting in a city that was grand, but frankly, probably a bit shoddy and hastily put together. It was a massive 20-year construction project, all dedicated to a single, newly invented deity. The art and culture that emerged from Amarna were just as strange and radical as the religion. The Amarna period art style is unmistakable. Pharaohs were shown with exaggerated, elongated features, long heads, prominent chins, narrow shoulders, and strangely wide hips and bellies. This was unheard of. Pharaohs were supposed to be depicted as stern, idealized, eternal warriors, not loving dads. Akhenaten's own physique in these depictions is particularly bizarre. He's often shown as almost androgynous or sickly. Some historians suggest he may have suffered from a medical condition that caused these features, but others argue it was a deliberate artistic choice to emphasize the new, unconventional nature of the divine king. Either way, it's a quiet, visual rebellion against thousands of years of boring, rigid artistic tradition. Nefertiti, the beautiful face. Akhenaten's queen was the famous Nefertiti. Her name means the beautiful one has come, and judging by her magnificent, iconic limestone bust, one of the most famous pieces of Egyptian art ever found, she was certainly a stunner. Nefertiti wasn't just a consort, she was a major force in the Atenist religion and clearly held immense power. She is frequently depicted wearing the royal crown, sacrificing to the Aten, and even driving a chariot, activities usually reserved only for the pharaoh. She was a quiet, powerful partner in this religious revolution. The reign of neglect. While Akhenaten was busy being a religious revolutionary, writing beautiful hymns to the Aten and redesigning the entire Egyptian aesthetic, the empire was falling apart. The core problem was that he was completely neglecting foreign policy and the bureaucracy. While the new kingdom was built on aggressively controlling the Near East and the Levant, Akhenaten spent most of his reign obsessing over theological purity in his desert city. We know this because of the Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found at the site. These are letters written on clay tablets from the kings and governors of Egyptian vassal states in Syria, Palestine, pleading with Akhenaten for help against their enemies. The letters are repetitive, desperate, and ultimately ignored. They sound like this: "Please, send troops. The enemies are besieging us. If you do not send archers, your city will fall. Your servant is loyal, but we need help now." Akhenaten's response, if any, was clearly too little too late. The letters show that the Egyptian empire was quietly, boringly, and systematically being eroded because the pharaoh was too busy worshiping the sun disk and commissioning new, weird statues of himself. It's a slow, managerial disaster, the perfect, non-dramatic end to a glorious empire. The reversal: Tutankhamun and the return to boring. Akhenaten died, probably about 17 years on the throne. We don't know exactly how, but the end of his revolutionary experiment was swift and decisive. His successor was a young king boy, his son, or maybe half-brother, who was originally named Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. This boy quickly changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. Tutankhamun was just a child, and the true power lay with his viziers, particularly one named A, and the general of the army, Horemheb. These were the old guard, the people who hated the chaos and the heresy. They immediately orchestrated a full-scale counter-revolution. The cult of Amun was restored to its full power and glory. The priests got their wealth back, and the capital city of Akhenaten, the desert palace of the heretic king, was abandoned. The people who lived there simply packed up and moved back to Thebes. Akhenaten became a ghost city, left to decay quietly in the desert sun. The most famous mummy in the world, Tutankhamun, is a historical footnote because he died young and was largely controlled by the forces of reaction. His only historical significance is that his tomb was intact, and therefore a spectacular accident of history. The final act of erasure was performed by Horemheb, who systematically destroyed all remaining monuments to Akhenaten, erased the names of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun from the official king lists, and declared that the entire Amarna period was a historical blank spot. He successfully wiped out the memory of the heretic pharaoh for over 3,000 years. It's a quiet, total historical scrubbing, the perfect systematic end to the existential crisis. And so, we leave Akhenaten's weird, failed revolution, a brief moment of philosophical turbulence in the vast, monotonous sea of Egyptian polytheism. Let the quiet desert wind whispering through the ruins of Amarna settle you into a deep, peaceful, boring sleep.
Welcome back for our final, quiet segment. I hope you're feeling perfectly relaxed, lulled by the gentle rhythm of failed Egyptian reforms and bureaucratic overreach. We've floated past the chaotic quiet of the Amarna period, and now we arrive at the absolute final peak of New Kingdom grandiosity, Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great. If Akhenaten was a quiet philosophical rebel, Ramesses II was a massive, loud, self-obsessed return to form. His reign was long, incredibly productive, and so utterly dedicated to self-aggrandizement that his story is the perfect, predictable capstone to the Egyptian imperial age. The king who lived forever, almost. Ramesses II ruled for an incredible 66 years, longer than nearly any other pharaoh, though still probably shorter than the conservative estimates for Pepi II. He died when he was around 90 years old, which, in the Bronze Age, was almost unheard of. Imagine being a young man, starting your career in the bureaucracy, and knowing you'd spend your entire working life under the same single ancient pharaoh. It's the ultimate low-stakes generational drain. Because he lived so long, he outlived at least 12 of his own sons. He had a truly absurd number of children.
Estimates range from 90 to over 100 children with various wives and concubines. His 13th son, Merneptah, was the one who finally succeeded him, and Merneptah was already an elderly man himself, probably in his late 60s, when he took the throne. It's a very quiet, slow-motion dynastic tragedy, watching your children and grandchildren die before you, simply because you live forever. The Battle of Kadesh and the Propaganda War. Ramesses II was a military man, but his main historical legacy is less about actual fighting and more about extreme self-promotion. His most famous military event was the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittites, a rival empire based in modern-day Turkey, around 1274 BC. This was a massive clash of chariots in Syria, and it was one of the first battles in history for which we have an extensive written record. The actual battle was, objectively, a military draw. It was messy, both sides claimed victory, and neither side gained much territory immediately afterward. But if you read Ramesses' account, it was the greatest victory of all time. Ramesses plastered his version of the Battle of Kadesh on the walls of nearly every major temple he built, at Karnak, Luxor, and his own mortuary temple, the Ramesseum. These reliefs and accompanying texts tell a detailed story of how he was betrayed by his own scouts, found himself alone and surrounded by thousands of Hittite chariots, but then, through sheer personal bravery and the divine intervention of Amun, he single-handedly rallied his troops and crushed the enemy. It's a magnificent, beautiful lie. It's pure, ancient Egyptian propaganda, repeated so often and so loudly that for centuries people believed it. Ramesses II was the king who understood that if you tell a story enough times and carve it into enough massive stone walls, it becomes true. The real result of this battle was a boring, crucial diplomatic achievement, the signing of the Kadesh Peace Treaty about 16 years later. This was a long-lasting, stable peace treaty, one of the first known international treaties in history, establishing spheres of influence and a mutual defense pact. This actual act of sensible, non-dramatic diplomacy was far more important than the battle itself, but it never made it onto the temple walls with the same swagger. No one wants to hear about the pharaoh signing paperwork. Ramesses and the Temple of Pure Ego. Ramesses II was arguably the most prolific builder in all of Egyptian history. He didn't just build new temples, he finished the temples of his predecessors, he added his own courtyards, and crucially, he often chipped out their names and replaced them with his own. It's a subtle, deeply dishonest form of architectural theft. The New Kingdom pharaohs were constantly stealing credit from each other by the boring, time-consuming effort of recarving hieroglyphs. It's the ancient equivalent of putting your name on someone else's PowerPoint presentation. But his ultimate, glorious monument to his own ego is the great temple complex at Abu Simbel in Nubia. Abu Simbel consists of two massive rock-cut temples. The Great Temple is the focus, built purely for Ramesses himself. The facade is dominated by 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses II, each over 65 feet tall. They are not merely big, they are aggressively huge, designed to intimidate anyone coming from the south and announce unequivocally, Ramesses is God on earth. The temple interior is a cavern of halls, columns, and reliefs, all dedicated to Ramesses' favorite subject, Ramesses. Inside the sanctuary, 4 statues are carved into the rock, the gods Ra-Horakhti, Amun-Ra, and Ptah. And the 4th statue is Ramesses II, deified while still alive. He literally placed himself in the company of the greatest gods in his own temple. The genius of Abu Simbel is in its solar alignment. Twice a year, on specific dates, probably marking his birth and coronation, the sun's rays penetrate the entire depth of the temple, illuminating the statues in the sanctuary. This required incredible, detailed astronomical and engineering precision. It's a massive, eternal stone calendar dedicated to the pharaoh's personal schedule. The small temple next to it is dedicated to the goddess Hathor, with an important caveat. It is also dedicated to his great royal wife, Nefertari. Again, the facade is dominated by 2 colossi of the queen and 4 colossi of Ramesses. Even when he was ostensibly honoring his wife, he still made sure there were twice as many statues of himself. It's a very quiet, very charming example of royal narcissism. The legacy of excess. Ramesses II's reign marks the high watermark of the New Kingdom. It was the last great burst of energy, construction, and power before a long, slow decline. His legacy is one of utter saturation. He put his name everywhere. He had more statues than anyone else. He built more temples than anyone else. He signed the longest peace treaty. He had the most children. He lived the longest. The entire landscape of New Kingdom Egypt is essentially one massive monument to Ramesses II's need to overshare his life and his achievements with the world. And that, finally, brings our quiet, long float through the dynastic weirdness of the pharaohs to a gentle close. We started with Sneferu and his collapsing bent pyramids, moved through the honey-covered servants of Pepi II and the paranoid fortresses of the Middle Kingdom, survived the bizarre theological crisis of Akhenaten, and ended with the enormous, ego-driven monuments of Ramesses II. The history of the pharaohs is not a history of endless, dramatic wars. It is a history of extreme longevity, expensive architectural obsessions, inbreeding, bureaucratic neglect, and the quiet, persistent human need for self-promotion. Let the smooth, predictable flow of the Nile, carrying the limestone blocks down to the next construction site, finally lull you into a deep, peaceful sleep. All that quiet, monotonous effort, all that perfectly boring history.